going as well. Well, she was a member of the Legislative Council in New South Wales for a long time, and she's just come into the Senate for the Greens as part of their massive upsizing and control of the balance of power. We're joined now by Senator Lee Rhiannon. Thanks for your company.
Good morning.
Are you a radical? In the introduction, I said you were sometimes described as a radical, described as a maverick. How do you describe yourself?
Yes, there's been a few words used. I suppose it's how you define it. If you consider that I take advice from the world scientists to work on climate change, I've been working with farmers to save agricultural land, working on cleaning up political donations. I mean, I think they become mainstream issues. They are becoming mainstream issues. So I suppose it depends on your definition. I'm proud of my track record.
You had quite an impact on the New South Wales Parliament. What are your priorities now that you're in the Senate? What are the areas where you'd like to make a difference?
Look, I certainly will be working hard to be an effective Greens senator for New South Wales. I have a number of portfolios. I do feel very passionate about the democratic process. I feel at this point in our history that democracy is quite stalled, so I will be looking at the issue of electoral funding and lobbyists. Obviously, the top priority is action on climate change. I am already looking at the issue of the New South Wales economy, because when you consider, and I was interested in the interview that you just had with the Treasurer, that he talked a great deal about the mixed economy, but there wasn't solutions coming forward. And you would have heard Senator Bob Brown often speak about the need to bring in the super profits tax on our resource industry. We need to go back to many of those measures in the Henry Review. So I'm already looking at a whole range of issues, both in my portfolio and also in the context of New South Wales.
When it comes to economic policy, though, what are the economic policy changes that you'd like to see introduced at the moment?
Well, in terms of the economy, I think it's worth probably starting with that issue that I just mentioned, is how we should respond with the resources boom that brings great benefits to Australia, but they're not being evenly shared. And I think we need to look at that across the country as well as across generations. So, as I just mentioned, I think we do need to get back to the recommendation from the Henry Review, and the government should have the courage to introduce...
But it's just not going to happen, though, is it? I mean, well, the Liberal Party don't support it, and Labor's not going to have the courage to go there again.
In the short term, you're right, but that's what life and politics is about. You keep pushing a point of view. So that's one issue. We also need the Sovereign Wealth Fund, so we're considering future generations. The issue of procurement is an interesting one, and it's in no way about returning to the era of protectionism, but we do need to have a level playing field for procurement, which we don't have at the moment. Like right now, these huge coal development in the Galilee Basin, China First, which is running it, a state-owned Chinese government company, he's bringing 5 companies in to do it. It's railways, it's ports, dig the coal. Exim Bank, China Exim Bank is coming. So there's incredibly unfair when it comes to procurement.
What do we do about that? Do you want the government to intervene and put firm conditions on those sort of deals, do you?
No, I'm not. Well, I think there certainly needs to be more regulation. I'm not saying immediately that we just bring in, it has to be procuring all Australian goods, but I'm obviously open to that. We acknowledge, and I certainly do, that I need more advice on it. But what I'm aware of is that there is not a level playing field at the moment. Many of these resource companies, overseas companies, come into Australia with all their own companies, and it is extraordinary that China, the Chinese government, is allowed to bring all their own companies in, and most of the profits go overseas. And our manufacturing is really the poor cousin in so much of these developments. And New South Wales is in a serious situation.
You've raised quite a lot of interesting points there, Senator, but can I come back to Peter's opening on the question of the radical? It is unusual to have a new senator or a new member of parliament in Australia really singing the praises of socialists and communists in their maiden speech, and you spoke of a revival of McCarthyist rhetoric around the place. Would it be sort of, while talking about your own history and so forth, shouldn't you have really sort of got into the issue of why socialism and communism got it so badly wrong?
Well, I think there's been a whole lot of really wrong things done, and I have often acknowledged the mistakes and the crimes that have been committed by different socialist countries. And I think probably what you're also referring there to is some of the comments from Michael Danby, Gerard Henderson sometimes comes into it, Paul Howes, all running their criticisms of me. And I think there's an interesting point here that I do actually acknowledge those crimes that have been committed, but I'm not beholden to one regime or to one government. And so I've also been critical of the French when they were testing their nuclear weapons in the Pacific.
Surely there's no parallel here whatsoever. I mean, between French tests on the one hand and the 20th century history of what communists did in a range of countries. I mean, surely that's a completely false comparison.
Well, I'm not comparing one crime to the other. My point is that how I live my life is that I will speak out against justice, injustice and oppression and exploitation. And I believe I have been consistent in doing that. I've been a member of the Greens for 20 years. I've stood up for our policies. If you look at my track record in Parliament, you can see what I've worked for. So a lot of this attacks on the work that I did when I was very young, I think has got a great deal to do with the fact that the Greens are in balance of power. And it's an attempt to smear us. It's not about actually engaging with the challenges that we have before us.
How keen are you to ensure that the Greens vote as a bloc to maintain their strength? There's been a lot said about how you didn't necessarily get on with your MLC colleagues in the Greens, but nonetheless, when you look at the data, you voted together on almost all occasions. Are you intending to apply that discipline to reinforce your strength in the Senate, or are you prepared to walk away from your Green senators if you don't agree with them on particular policies?
Well, firstly, just before we leave the last question, I certainly want to emphasise that I welcome the scrutiny. There's no question about that. To take your question, Peter, is again, I think and you in part answered it, while there was this criticism that I supposedly didn't get on. Firstly, there is always differences in politics, but you can still have a united party room. And we enormously had that in the New South Wales Parliament, and our runs are on the board. Like, we gained that reform in terms of political donations. There's now the ban is in place on all donations from the tobacco sector, from developers, for the for-profit alcohol and gambling industries. A huge change, and we were able to get wins in other areas. So I have a deep commitment to working with my colleagues, and I'm certainly continuing to do that in the federal parliament.
Coming forward to going back to economic policy, and you sort of opened up the issue of whether there should be mandating of Australian content, particularly manufacturing, for this massive pipeline of resource projects. How is that mandating that there should be a certain level, 20, 30, 40, 50% of Australian content in resource projects? How is that any different from putting up import barriers to imports into Australia, which was dismantled largely in the 1980s and 1990s, which has produced the better economic performance that we've seen? How is that different to protectionism?
No, I wasn't nominating any level. The language I used is that there should be a level playing field. What you're seeing now is that the Australian government does have a hands-off approach to how the mining boom is occurring, and that's playing out to the disadvantage of the education, the tourism and the manufacturing sector. All I'm saying when it comes to the manufacturing sector, and as I said before, I certainly would take advice on this. I'm not an expert, but what you can see is that there isn't a level playing field, that Australian companies and Australian workers are being disadvantaged because many of the resource companies that come in here have it all sewn up as part of the deal. And that example that I gave, it is extraordinary. China First in the Galilee Basin, possibly the biggest coal mine in Australia, is bringing in 5 Chinese state-owned companies. And just going back to your point before about the attacks on myself, because, you know, that I was in the Socialist Party, I think it's worth noting that I've been the one who is speaking out against the involvement of the Chinese government in these Australian mining companies. I was the first one to name China Shenhua because of that they are buying up farming land in the Liverpool Plains, the first politician, to name that. And the Nationals are playing catch-up. Labor and the Liberals are avoiding the issue. I will continue to take on these issues when it's unfair, where there's exploitation, where there's impression.
Where's the exploitation in this?
Well, I think Australia is being exploited because we haven't got a government with the courage to say, yes, there's this mining boom, we need to ensure that Australia gets a fair share of the benefits from it and they're distributed fairly across this country.
I'd like to ask you about Israel. You've supported the boycotts, disinvestment and sanction policy. How serious are you about this? Do you want to terminate trade between Australia and Israel and terminate cultural, sporting and academic ties? Is that your actual position?
Yes, well, let's talk about that issue. So thanks for the question, because it's one that's often been distorted in some papers, how it's been presented. The boycott, divestment and sanctions movement is an international movement that's actually growing in support. And I think it's worth remembering.
But I want to ask you what it means in this country now if your policy is applied. Can you tell us that?
Well, it does mean it's a boycott similar to how it played out when the campaign against anti-apartheid grew against South Africa. And these boycott movements are across the board, as you've described, in the different areas.
So you terminate trade arrangements?
Well, it depends on who companies, but it is. You're correct. It's very broad-based. I acknowledge that.
Cultural ties, no Israeli film festival, no Israeli sporting teams. Is that what you're advocating?
It depends on what the position of those organisations, those companies are. If they have acknowledged the issue for the Palestinians, and if they're working with the Palestinians to ensure their rights and justice comes from them, well, then it's a different matter. But when you consider the present situation, we do need to stand up for the human rights of Palestinians. And this movement is growing around the world, as the boycott against racist South Africa did. I know it's been misrepresented and discredited in this country, but across Europe and North America, it is gaining more support.
Well, I'd just like to clarify, so as a new senator, you will continue to advocate and champion this particular policy and try and persuade your other colleagues to come on board with you?
Look, how I've explained it is that I'm quite aware that Bob Brown has a different approach on this, that within the federal parliament there isn't the support for this issue at the present time. But in the wider community there is growing understanding about the need to take a stand for Palestinian human rights. So I'm not taking this into the Senate at the present time.
And what about boycotting individual Israeli businesses? Do you support that?
Well, as I explained before, it depends on how that business operates, but where they're giving support to the Israeli state.
But under circumstances you are prepared to target and boycott individual businesses?
Look, I see the value of that tactic as a way to promoting Palestinian human rights. Let's remember...
Don't you think that's very divisive to actually do something like that, given the history? Don't you think that's an exceptionally divisive step?
Not at all. It's actually, as I repeat, and you just need to look at the movements growing across Europe and in North America.
But if we just focus on Australia, I think.
No, but quite seriously, it is gaining more support within Australia. Politicians, and with all due respect to the three of you, the News Limited, I would say, is just out of step in their the way they present this issue.
Senator, can I ask... you spoke in your inaugural speech about commitment to improving the everyday lives of working Australians. Are you concerned about what we've seen with the Health Services Union and Craig Thompson, that unions that are there supposedly to support some of our lowest paid workers are really wasting their members' money?
Look, clearly, unions have an incredibly important role in any society, and I think right now in Australia it's an increasingly important role. With regard to your specific question, this matter is before the police, and we'll obviously watch that closely. If anybody has any further information about union activities that they're concerned about, that they think might be wrong...
But you must be alarmed that, there's credible reports that that on the expenses of this union have gone towards paying for, as we've read, prostitution services, etc., etc. That must be an alarming thing, for that low-paid workers, their union dues, are going to this sort of thing for you.
Look, if that's happened, of course it's wrong, and it needs to be, the union needs to clean up their act very quickly. I mean, these are low-paid workers that are being done over in a whole number of areas, and the union is often their most important backstop.
And you're satisfied that Fair Work Australia has been, the regulatory body has been onto this quickly enough? Because it seems to have taken a hell of a long time for them to get around to looking at it seriously.
Look, I don't know any more detail than I actually read in The Australian and in other areas, and so it's one that we're watching closely.
All right, Senator Lee Rhiannon, welcome to the Senate, and thanks for joining us on Australian Agenda.
Thank you.
When we come back from the break, we'll take a close look at the state of the Middle East in light of what's been happening in Libya. Back in a moment.